Hey, welcome to Transformation. I'm Mike Sherbino. Just delighted that you're with us today as we're unpacking a subject that I've called Redefining Success. Whenever you think about success, there is always a story. We got a great story for you today. A guy named Scott Wallace is going to be sharing his journey all the way from Ireland, being kidnapped with the IRA, to Saskatchewan, and then to Vancouver and to Toronto. A little bit of eHarmony is going to be all blended into it as we think about the different components that go into his story. Well, what about your story? What's going to anchor us today in our conversation is that I also want to unpack to you the man that I think was probably one of the most successful people in the scriptures, possibly in all of time. His name was Nehemiah. Why is that? Well, if you jump on a plane and go to Tel Aviv and get off it and take the bus to Jerusalem, you'll see a wall that he built in 52 days. It is nothing short of a miracle. It seemed like an impossible situation, but we're going to discover as we listen to Scott, as we look at Nehemiah, that success really is about taking your story and turning it into the story that God always intended it to be. Hope you'll stay with us today. You can check us out on our website. You can see those running along underneath the screen, MikeSherbino.org. We're glad you're with us. Let's go right now and talk to Scott. So glad you came through a huge storm to be here. Welcome.
Coming from Toronto to St. Catharines without traffic, that's a successful journey.
So there's different ways to define success. We want to take you back to where you got that funny accent from, the place called Ireland.
Sure.
You were 13 years old, and something very powerful happened in your life. Tell me about that, because you forgot about it for many years.
Yeah, it's interesting that at the time you don't realize that this is a powerful moment or that there is anything there. I was confirmed whenever I was 13 in the Church of Ireland. And my auntie, I believe, gave me a book, which is the Book of Common Prayer and Church Hymnal. And on 18th of February, 1990, I wrote, "I give my life to the Lord Jesus Christ, trusting him to forgive my sins and to forgive my life and to give me the gift of eternal life. I gladly place the whole of my future into his hands." Signed it, covenantal style.
You were 13?
13.
Okay, so that's an interesting statement. Forgot all about it.
Forgot all about it.
And then all sorts of interesting things happened, including you got kidnapped one day by the IRA.
Yeah.
Jump ahead. Tell us what you were doing.
Sure. I mean, I was working at a job that the company supplied amusement arcade games. And in the 1990s and throughout time in Northern Ireland, those kind of companies would have to have paid protection money to paramilitaries in order for their businesses to remain safe. I'm assuming that the business that I was working for at the time wasn't paying the money, as we were doing a bank. We were on the way down into the town to lodge money. We got bookended by two cars, commandeered. The vehicle was commandeered. They knew exactly the driver's name, where he lived, all of those pieces of information. He was pistol whipped and put into the back of the car. I was kind of shoved in between them. They took off through the back hills into Belfast, into a predominantly Catholic estate.
This sounds a bit like Mission Impossible.
It's something that whenever you grow up in Northern Ireland, it's normal in a sense. Wow. Like armor-plated vehicles driving around the streets. And my dad used to check under his car every morning for incendiaries and bombs, because he, as a photocopying engineer, would drive into police stations, army barracks, and that actually made him a target for the paramilitaries because he was doing them a service. So that's, I grew up.
So it was just part of life.
It was just part of life, like bomb scares on your street, on armies on the street, the British Army.
I remember seeing pictures. I remember watching it, but it's a whole other thing to be there.
Yeah, but it's normal because you're raised in it. Do you know what I mean?
So as you're living in that environment,
yeah,
how did you think about success? What was it driving you, and what did you want to do and accomplish? Because music was a big part of your life.
Music was always a thing. Then DJing became a thing around, the mid-90s or whatever. So I was pursuing trying to become a DJ, and I always had a lust for glorious. And I wanted people to know my name. I wanted to be famous. I wanted to have that limelight. You know, I wasn't sure how that was due to come.
And you'd be DJing through all these events.
Well, and the thing is
doing
that,
music.
like, I don't even know how to get into the scene. So there was a radio station on Saturday and Sunday nights. I called up one day and I said, how do you become an MC? Because these guys were just DJing. The DJs on the station connected me with an MC in Belfast, and an MC is just somebody who would rap over the dance music. Wow. I met him, I became an MC. I started to appear in all of the clubs in Northern Ireland, and then I fell in with promoters, and then through that I got to start DJing. So I realized, like, this is what I wanted to do. I wanted to be a DJ.
Hey, were you hearing what I was hearing when Scott was talking about the external environment that he lived in Northern Ireland? I mean, to me, it just seems chaotic. It would rivet me full of fear, but for him, it was just the normal. And as I begin to think about what success looks like, I'm convinced that success is taking your story and discovering the significance about it. Your situation, you might feel like it's just like Northern Ireland. There's chaos everywhere, but in the middle of that, God wants to teach you that you can walk through it. We're going to get to Nehemiah today, and here he is. He's the cupbearer. It's just like his normal, but every day his life was on the line because he would test the food. I mean, if the food was bad, dead Nehemiah, long live the king. And you imagine living with that kind of stress, not unlike what Scott was talking about. But in the middle of that, Scott talked about another thing about success that could be driving you. It was the lust for glory. It was what he wanted. And you know, as much as that drives us and we want to be in the limelight, sometimes the limelight can be the slimelight. And Scott's going to unpack that in the next part, that it wasn't all that he thought it would be. And maybe that's where you're at today in your journey. So stay with us. We're going to hear from Scott, and we're going to learn more from Nehemiah. You had a conversation one night in a bar and brought you to Canada. So you took a big risk. What was that all about?
So I'm playing in a very small bar in Belfast. This guy walks in called Yusuf, and he's about 5'6". He's Filipino and Indian. So he immediately didn't look like anybody else in the room. And we got on, and I remember his name is Yusuf, but it was so loud. I said, "What's your name?" And I thought that he said, "My name is Jesus." And I was like, "Oh, this dude's name's Jesus."
This is interesting, eh?
You know? As he was leaving, he's like, "I know you have a life and everything here, but you could do really well in Canada. We have a really strong scene in Saskatoon. I know people in Manitoba and Alberta, and I think that if you decided to come over and DJ in our city, you would become the big fish."
How long did it take you to make the decision to go?
Right away.
Wow.
Right away. You only, in a small country like Northern Ireland, it's very insular. Okay. You only get this sort of chance once. There's nobody else is going to come over to me and say, "Hey, I like what you're doing as a DJ. You should come to a completely different country."
So you came, and there's so many pieces to this story.
Yeah. So yeah, I arrived in Saskatoon in the tail end of winter. Boy.
What a wake-up call.
What a wake-up call. I didn't, Yusuf was telling me, well, if you come over in winter, you should maybe leave it to the end of winter because, moving houses and the electricity. And I'm thinking to myself,
what's he talking about,
this is going to be rustic.
Hey, the first time I went to Saskatoon, it was -30. And
I experienced
I didn't even know
those.
that feeling.
I experienced those, but I had the best time in Saskatoon. I had the best group of people. Yeah, I met a girl, fell in love.
But tell us about that. Suddenly, because in this whole path of trying to be successful in pursuing a dream, all sorts of things happen. And so you have a girlfriend and now an immigration crisis.
Yeah, so I was working and I got a job. So I should preface this by saying that I came over to Canada without any real idea about the legalities of being here and the paperwork and all of these things. So I had been working in a record store, which is one of the most prominent jobs that I could have in Saskatoon in the dance music scene.
Okay.
And I took a week off, and I remember calling my boss to say, I had the strangest dream last night. The 2 FBI agents came in looking for me, and he was like, and this is not a word of a lie, he's like, 2 agents came in looking for you yesterday. And I thought,
my goodness,
they gave me a choice, get married or go home.
And is that what you told your girlfriend?
She was there because once I realized that they were looking for me, I kind of went underground for a few days, and she ended up calling the immigration office to say, we will come in, but you're not going to just handcuff him and take him away. So I went in, met the guy. He was, quite nice, and he said, realistically, you have to have a sponsor to be here, and the only sponsor you can get right now would be if you were married. So
you got married.
So we got married. We didn't tell her parents about it. We just said a group of friends, and a justice of the peace. I did not want to go home. Like I was leaving Northern Ireland for good. Shortly after we got married, my wife was discovered in a model search. So she took off to go to New York and Miami and Japan and all of these places. So as she was traveling, I decided I would go to...
Not a good way to develop a marriage.
No, not out of the gate.
No.
We were young. But I decided to go to Vancouver because I had developed contacts out there. Went to Vancouver, pounded the pavements, got my first legal job in Starbucks.
Let me interrupt for a second. Yeah. What was driving you to keep, at this point, was it just survival?
Survival.
Or were you believing you were going to be successful?
Both.
Okay.
Surviving to be successful.
As we continue to unpack the story of Scott, I began to think about all the different boxes of success that he might have been checking off in his mind. I mean, there was the start in Northern Ireland, and then there's that encounter he has with the fellow in the bar who says, you need to come to Canada. And suddenly he sees this as the next move, so he checks that off. He does what you have to do. There's a driving passion in him. And then, of course, there's the love story. You have to have a little romance in any story, don't you? He meets his girlfriend, and how pivotal is that? But then suddenly to be caught by immigration and realizing in a moment, we got to make a decision. Do I jump off the cliff or do I run back? And he jumps off the cliff, he goes for it, they get married. But unfortunately, they don't live happily ever after. One of the things that I hear in Scott's story that might be in yours is that we like to think for a moment that we're masters of our own destiny. Before we go back and hear the final part of Scott's story, listen to author and pastor Tim Keller as he writes these words. He says, more than other idols, personal success and achievement lead to a sense that we ourselves are God, that our security and value rest in our own wisdom, strength, and performance. To be the very best at what you do, to be at the top of the heap, means no one is like you. You are supreme. We want to live with the illusion that we're God, that we're in control, but are we? You know, it seems like there's a whole lot of converging paths that were happening in your life. I'm thinking back to when you were 13 and that profession of faith that you made and what you said, and suddenly you get thrown into a trunk by the IRA, and then you're tracing and you're trying to pull it all together. You find yourself in Saskatchewan, and then Vancouver. You get married, and then you get unmarried, you get divorced, and I don't know, Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. How did that shape your life? How was that a key path that God used to redirect you?
About 10 months after I joined the club, it was in a bit of turmoil. It was in between leadership. So we became part of a new association, and this association sent a black belt from Brazil to our club to manage it. He came up and he was just such an encouraging man, real faith in Jesus, very outward, expression of that, and just...
Did that bother you when you heard him make these expressions of faith?
No, there's a couple of other people in the Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu community, big players that are very vocal about faith in Jesus. So I just accepted George at face value. You know, here he is, this guy from Rio's come up into a foreign country, doesn't really speak much English, trying to teach us the martial art. And he drew people to him. And I was one of the people that got drawn into him. And I was training 5 days a week at the club.
Okay, so that's a big part of your life, your work with the radio station, all the online stuff. Would you have ever classified yourself as an atheist or an agnostic in all of this point, or how were you starting to experience this God that George was talking about?
So, yeah, I mean, I guess that I would say I was agnostic, but the real first sign of God showing up in my life was I was a scout leader for 5 years in Toronto as well. And again, I find things to pour myself into.
Right.
And I was at a point in my life where I just needed to pour myself into many things just in order to keep me developing. I love being challenged. I love, learning new things. So we were at scout camp one Sunday, and I wasn't a Christian at that time, but I was a scout for my whole life in Northern Ireland. And we always did Scout Zone on Sunday, which was a religious service. So we were at camp on Toronto Island, and I did a Scout Zone. And there was this moment of just wind, that took over the campsite during this Scout Zone time of prayer. And that was the first time I felt God really, his presence just surround me and comfort me and be tangible in a sense where I could feel just this different presence around me,
So tell me, how did you eventually experience the love of Christ in your life?
I was working with a fellow who was Jewish, and radio is you don't have a long lifetime in radio. Like, it's a very cutthroat industry. And yet somehow I keep surviving after a lot of different episodes and manager changes and different things that I had done that were foolish at the radio station. But I said to Alex, how am I still here? And he's like, I honestly believe that God is looking out for you.
This is your Jewish friend.
This is my Jewish friend. And at this, we were having a conversation, and this is the first guy that had ever said to me, I believe God is looking out for you. And I just allowed myself to be open to that instead of shunning it or being like, whatever. I was like, you really believe that God's looking out for me? And he went through my life with me as I had spoken to him. And he had said, here's where God is showing up for you. And right enough, if I look back at my life and even further back into my parents' life, God was showing up at different times.
And also the paths were converging, all sorts of things were happening.
Everything was converging. And one night, I found myself on my kitchen floor because I thought that I had dropped some marijuana on it, and I was looking forward to put it in a pipe. I had nothing in the house, and I'm naked on a tiled kitchen floor at like 3 a.m, and I stopped and I said, "This is brokenness. Like, how low am I right now? Where I'm on the floor." Just this recognition of this isn't normal behavior. This is broken behavior. This is brokenness. And
in that moment, something happened.
And in that moment, I just, I believe that was the first sign that I recognized my brokenness. And obviously as a Christian, that's where, we realize God reaches down and in these moments.
And many times success means that you're in control. You're the master of your own destiny.
There was no control here. And then,
what did you pray? What did you say anything? Did you
Well,
cry?
at that stage, I couldn't do anything, because this was a very violent one. And then I was sort of rested down onto my bed, and I was breathing, and I just prayed. I screamed, "Lord, take me! Like, take everything, take it all." And at that stage, I was. The power that came upon me, that the Lord brought, was just incredible. Like, it was like he pressed the reset button, I remember my earliest way of being able to describe it to people was before I had purple energy and now I had blue energy. And that was the only way that I could describe it at the time.
Coming out of the rave experience.
Yeah. But I mean, I was honestly like, this was a full supernatural conversion, a full encounter with Jesus.
How long ago was that?
This was 8 years ago, and I remember once he laid me down, and like, we're talking like real convulsions, like real tears, real like body pouring of sweat.
Did you know that God loved you at that point?
In a moment, because once he laid me down and I was able to breathe, the first thing I did was jump to the end of my bed, and I just prayed. I was praying hard. It was like, "Lord, thank you. I don't know what happened." And he audibly spoke to me, and he said, the bondage that you feel is now gone. You have been set free.
That's the power of God.
And I just wept. I just wept, And I
Was it
grabbed.
true? Is that true? Did it happen?
So as of the next day, there was no more marijuana, and I had tried a lot of different techniques in order to give it up, to not be dependent on it. And in a moment,
Tell me the final part, the new wife.
Can
Can you tell me in 30 seconds the eHarmony story?
Yeah, signed up on eHarmony before I was a Christian, wrote spiritual, got matched with Amanda, who's a Christian but was living in Toronto and having some fun partying. And then my profile flipped to Christian. We met up to have a first date. My friends told me, don't talk about Jesus or jiu-jitsu. She asked me why.
Or politics, maybe?
Or she asked me why my profile had changed from spiritual to Christian. I told her, I mentioned it. She said, well, I've been a Christian my entire life. And
Too
then
funny.
the floodgates just opened for that as well. And God actually used me to bring her back into a
We
relationship
need to have her
with
on
him.
the program at some point.
Yeah,
Tell her story
she has an amazing testimony
of
as well.
coming back to Jesus.
Yeah, and now we're both actively involved in the church. She leads worship. I'm an elder of the church. Have been, sharing our faith. Now we have 2 kids.
We're thinking about success. Now you have a wife, 2 kids. Do you have a white picket fence?
No, I have a black belt in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu though.
Okay,
so.
that's cool. And all the trademarks of success. What about the happily ever after? What's that mean for you now?
Happiness is my measure of success. One of the books that I just love of the Bible is Ecclesiastes, where we're instructed to take enjoyment in our toil, in our labor, because it is a blessing and a gift from God. And that's how I measure success. Some people would measure it financially or with, houses or cars, things like that. I may never attain any of those things, especially not living in Toronto with the price of houses. But I come home every day to a wife and 2 beautiful girls. I have my health.
Scott, as you're telling this story, it's an amazing story. Seeing all the different paths that God brought into your life, converging into the point where you're at today. And no one could have scripted it except God. And God is writing a story in my life, in your life, and in the lives of the people that are watching today. I want you to know that Scott's story is unique to him. Your story is unique to you. But God wants to take you where you're at. He wants to redefine what success means for you so that you can become the man, the woman that He's created you to be. Despite the pain, whether it's a kidnapping, whether it's a drug problem, whether it's a failed marriage, He wants to take that and make you into the man, the woman that you've been created to be. Scott, I just want to thank you so much for being here. It's an amazing story. You've only told parts of it, but thank you for giving us a glimpse into your life. Yeah.
Thank you so much for having me.
As I've been listening to Scott's story along with you, I've been cognizant of the fact that it seems that there are 2 lies that constantly come to the surface when we think about success. One of those lies has been packaged as the American dream or the Canadian dream. It's this: you can be whatever you want in the world. You can be the prime minister. You can be the president. The other lie is this: you can be the very best. And the reason I say that they are lies is because it takes God out of the picture. And as we think of life and the whole success story, the different things happening, converging together, we think about it in Scott's life. I want you to think about your own life as well. Are you really in control? What would it mean to surrender yourself to God and discover His success story in your life? That's why Nehemiah helps us. It was an incredible, miraculous accomplishment that he did, but he was a cupbearer. In some ways, he was a nobody. He was working, he was a slave in Susa, the palace, which had been taken over from the Babylonians. But there as a cupbearer, he would taste the food, he would taste the drink, but he was in the presence of the king every day and eventually became a trusted confidant. It seemed like starting from nowhere, yet God was weaving a plan. And maybe you've thought, with the ups and downs of my life, I'm going nowhere. But hold on, there is God, and He wants you to hear His part of the story. Things had not been going well back in Jerusalem. And in Nehemiah 1 verse 2, we read that one of the men named Hananiah comes back, and Nehemiah asks him what was going on. It becomes such a critical point because as he hears what's happening back in Jerusalem, that the walls have not been built up, that they're constantly being attacked by enemies, his heart goes out and it starts to bleed for what's to happen. And what's to happen over there is that God was going to begin to move him in his own heart to believe that he could be part of not just a success story, but a miraculous story. I believe that's what can happen in your life as well today. And as we read in the story, we see that I asked them concerning the Jews who'd escaped, who'd survived the exile, and concerning Jerusalem. And they said to me, the remnant there in the province who had survived the exiles are in great trouble and shame. The wall of Jerusalem is broken down. Its gates are destroyed by fire. It's desolation, folks. And then it says, as soon as I heard these words, I sat down and wept and mourned for days. And I continued fasting and praying before the God of heaven. Here's what happened in Nehemiah's life. He was confronted with something that he didn't know what to do with. And so he brings it to God. He hears a story. I think of Scott's story in the midst of brokenness when he's there butt naked on the floor and realizing, this is my place of brokenness. I need God in my life. Nehemiah is standing before the king thinking, what on earth can I do? There's a deplorable situation 800 miles away in Jerusalem. What can I do? But he believes that God has a plan. We're going to unpack that next week in the teaching. But for today, notice this. I see signs of success in Nehemiah as a leader because, first of all, he listened. He listened to what Hananiah was saying. And he didn't just listen with his ears, he listened with his heart. And as he listened, and that's a sign of success, you choose to listen. He heard God starting to stir something in his heart, just like Scott's heart was being stirred to realize there had to be something more in his life as well. Nehemiah says, God, what am I supposed to do? And we read these words that he started to pray. He started, actually the scripture says there's an order to it. He said, he sat down and he wept. He was broken. And then he mourned for days, which is the internal grieving when he heard what was happening. And then it says he started to fast and pray. And by fasting, it means he set himself apart to hear God and say, God, what are you saying in the midst of my story? And he allowed God to take his story, and he believed that God could do something far greater than he ever could imagine. Next week, we're going to see where he goes into the king. And to his amazement, to his surprise, God is preparing the king to work in a powerful way. Just like in Scott's story, there was a guy named George who came and taught him the things of God. There was that little thing on eHarmony where he'd be lined up with the right woman who would actually meet the needs of his life. Scott would discover that. Nehemiah discovered God's presence was so real. And today, as we leave you on transformation, let God do the work of transformation in your life, taking your story and making it significant, because he does love, he does care for you, and he's waiting for you to listen to what he is saying. I hope you'll write to us today. I hope you'll check out that online web service that we have where you can talk to people who have a need and who are there to help you with your need. We're glad you've been watching today. I'm Mike Sherbino.